Coming up on today's Locked On Bucks, Frank is back with us. We get into optimistic views of the Milwaukee Bucks this upcoming season and teams in the Eastern Conference we don't feel quite as optimistic about. The holistic view of the Eastern Conference with Frank Madden and Camille Davis comes your way next on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia and about to be joined by Frank Madden and Camille Davis. We thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen each and every day. We are free and available wherever it is you get your podcasts. You can view us on YouTube as well. All parts of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's Locked On Bucks is brought to you by Game Time, as now is the time with Game Time. Download the app, create an account, and use the code Locked On NBA to get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game Time. All right, as we just knocked out the over-under win total draft with Frank and Camille on yesterday's show, and today, joined by Frank once again, we shift our conversation to some topics Camille and I touched on earlier in the week, the reasons for optimism and pessimism for the Milwaukee Bucks. We focus quite a bit on optimism, as Frank is a firm believer that this team is going to outperform expectations this season. So we get into that conversation, and on the flip side, some of the teams in the Eastern Conference that we think the Bucks are in a better position than comes your way after this on Locked On Bucks. Well, and that's the other part of this is the wins have to come from somewhere. So as you're putting this together, if you think the Bucks are going to be a pretty good bet there to be over that win total, who are they taking those wins from in the Eastern Conference? And as you start to pile up those teams, so that's what made it even more challenging is I think we're all naturally inclined to say, oh, this team's going to outperform and this team's going to outperform. And you start adding all that up and then realize who are the teams that are going to come under now, because we can't have every single team outperforming their win total. And that's where I kind of was too, is Camille and I have talked about it quite a bit so far. I think we're both pretty optimistic about the group that the Bucks have. We talked about it with you earlier in the offseason too, Frank, that it's not to say that, hey, I'll stack this roster up against what Boston has with some of their versatility, but top to bottom, it is a better roster than it was a season ago. Take the whole Doc Rivers component out of it, as I know he's a very polarizing figure on the sidelines, but you're in a better spot with your coach and coaching staff than you were a season ago. We didn't know what Adrian Griffin would bring, if he could do the job. And as we learned, probably not. Doc Rivers, while you can criticize many other things, you can't question, is Doc Rivers capable of being an NBA head coach? And then, oh, by the way, the other thing that I think we forget quite a bit when we talk about reasons to be optimistic for this team is, last year we all talked about it. Another interesting wrinkle of sorts to last year was you weren't really sure what to make of the bench, of the coaching staff either. And that was not the case year over year under Bud. And especially when you saw Terry Stotts leave before the season started, it's not the case this year. When you think about Darvin Ham rejoining the team and Dave Yeager and Rex Kalamian still there in year number 2 with Doc Rivers, even Greg Buckner, who was the associate head coach for the Cavs. So they've added to it. And in that sense, you feel like it's a better roster and it's a much better coaching staff than it was when we were starting the season last year.
Yeah. I mean, you had with Terry Stotts leaving, essentially what Joe Prunty and Patrick Mutombo were probably the two leads, most trusted voices on the bench. And, mad respect. Love me some Joe Prunty, the ultimate survivor, but
front dog.
But yeah, I mean, you ran off the list, Justin. The amount of experience that they have on the bench right now behind Doc is pretty remarkable. So just from a like professionalization of, the staff, how many wins is that worth? I don't know. But you guys have pointed out as well. I mean, look at Doc's regular seasons. I mean, he's had a lot of very, very good regular seasons. He's not a guy. I mean, obviously there's questions about him when he's got closeout games in the playoffs and things like that, which we can address that later. But certainly from the perspective of like a guy that knows how to get wins in the regular season, a guy that can get his teams to play defense. I mean, you look at the Sixers a couple of years ago, in his last year there. Obviously, it didn't work out the way they wanted in the playoffs, but that was, as much as I think, I guess Bucks had the best record at the end. Like that team, like there was that, I think from like Christmas on, like I think they were the best team in the league.
Yeah.
And so he found what works, and there's always going to be kind of the things that people criticize Doc for, but I think they have certainly a roster that has, I think, the talent and I would say versatility as well. Like, would I like to have one more, switchable big defender? Well, sure. But, again, like that's just part of the trade-off, right? You have between Giannis, Bobby, and Brooke, I think you have a pretty complementary group of big men. And then, I think obviously what they did with the bench, especially with their minimum signings, was obviously a net positive. And, now we'll see, can any of the young guys take the step up that we like perpetually are hoping for? Like to be determined. But at some point they should develop somebody by accident, you would think. So we'll see if that's, AJ Green, Andre Jackson, do we still talk about Marjon Beauchamp? I don't know.
They're due.
Chris Livingston making Justin look like a genius, we'll see. But I mean, the upside again is, for better or worse, they really don't need the young guys to be, to have a breakout, young guy in order to be a great regular season team that competes for a championship. And that's, again, like your mileage may vary. I'm sure people are going to get mad when Taurean Prince is getting minutes over, and he goes into a slump and he's getting minutes over, Ajax. But, that's just kind of how this stuff works. And that's kind of the reality of being a high-end team that's trying to win ball games today.
Passion, drive, and patience. That's the formula for winning championships, and also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. So let me, because Camille, I know you're very high on the obviously drafting them and thinking they're going to outperform their win total. So let me ask both of you guys this: if and Frank, it sounds like you were too, and kind of aligned with Eric in some of that thought. The general consensus, I would say, among the national perspective is the Bucks are probably going to finish fourth in the Eastern Conference. Who do they bump out? If we expect the Bucks are going to be pretty good this year, and being under the radar is a good thing. It's one of those teams that's in front of them that maybe they're not ready for that, and the Bucks are going to finish in front of them. Who is most likely of that group to be the team that's bumped out of there for the Bucks?
Well, I think it's fair to say you got Boston finishing ahead of Milwaukee for sure. Defending champs get the respect, so on and so forth. And the roster construction, they bring a lot of the same guys back. You look at Philly, a team that could be really good in the regular season as well, which is what I'm banking on for Philly, thinking like I could see them being 2 in the East. And then I'll put Milwaukee right there afterwards. The only other team that I would think that's really, I shouldn't say the only team, that's disrespectful to a few other teams in the East, but that other team that, was getting a lot of attention is the New York Knicks, where it's like they could be a 3 seed this upcoming season. But personally, I'm just not seeing it all the way for New York. I like what they did. I like what they have built. But that would be the team that I would say I would bump out of that top 3 for the Bucks. The other team that you would throw on there is like Cleveland. And I don't think switching the coach alone is going to be enough for Cleveland to overtake the Bucks in the standings. So that's probably how I would look at it. And one more Milwaukee Bucks piece to it when approaching the regular season. Last year, we heard a lot of noise about them being ready for the playoffs. And even once we got to the end of the season, Doc Rivers mentioned like, well, we're here now for better or for worse. And this is what they've been waiting for all year, which said to me a little bit like they weren't taking the regular season as seriously. They just kept waiting to get to the playoffs. And now they're coming into a season where they've heard all this noise about the team, what they can't do. And I think it's just another thing for them to try to go out and prove throughout the regular season. Like, you know what? We are really here. We're trying to build that momentum. And I can see them getting a couple of wins out of that mental shift of how they approach to the season as well.
I thought Camille was going to give us a Jim Mora playoffs line there for a second. I think the Knicks are really interesting. I drafted the Knicks in our little over under draft today with my 6th pick. So again, I've got literally everybody but the Bucks basically among the good East teams. I'm really interested in the Knicks. I kind of forget that they only won 50 games last year, and I mean they had a lot of like kind of stinker losses. Right. Well, I was gonna say like late in the regular season, like they were not like a buzzsaw.
No,
basically they were awesome when they had OG Anunoby for that kind of brief period. And I just think it's really interesting. I mean, like of course, bringing in Mikal Bridges, like I mean, yeah, who wouldn't want Mikal Bridges on your team? But I'm really curious to see what losing Hartenstein means for that team, especially given how frequently Mitchell Robinson has had, pretty serious injuries, like ankle and leg injuries that keep him out for, extended periods or whatever it might be. So because that's a team that I think certainly like they could play small effectively. But I think we've seen, especially like long stretches of the regular season, like I just don't think playing small is just like a sustainable way to win a lot of regular season games. I think it's a incredibly important thing to be able to do matchup wise in the playoffs and maybe like late in games. But the idea that you're going to just like play OG Anunoby at center for like, 20 minutes a game or something if Mitchell Robinson gets hurt, like I don't think they can do that either. And, like when the Mitchell Robinson injury happens and, Tibbs inevitably says, Taj, get over here, wheels out Taj for his, 29th NBA season or wherever he is at this point.
Wait, didn't he sign with the Hornets this offseason?
I don't know. I'm kind of just joking. I just assume he's not signed anywhere, but you sound like you actually know the correct answer, Camille. I'll have to find somebody else. I don't know who else from his Bulls days Tibbs can dig up. But yeah, I'm just so interested to see it. I mean, they were a buzzsaw when Anunoby was there, but you look at like the top 3 trios, the best trio lineups. Bucks were second behind the Knicks, and that Knicks lineup though included Hartenstein. So some of their absolute best lineups included Isaiah Hartenstein, and you just look at the way, kind of their identity of just being able to like kind of bludgeon teams to death with offensive rebounding and all that. Certainly you can do that with Mitchell Robinson, but Mitchell Robinson is not playing.
The Bucks saw it firsthand.
Yeah, exactly. Robinson's probably the best one-man rebounding wrecking crew, offensive rebounding wrecking crew in the league. But again, like just his durability is a question mark. And then, like Precious Achiuwa is fine, like he's okay. But, the idea of, how you're going to slow down like a Giannis, for instance, right? Like you'd feel a lot better if you had, 48 minutes of big rim protectors that you could roll out there in addition to Anunoby and Bridges and all those guys. So I think they're going to be good, but I don't know. I mean, Tibbs, like the Tibbs record is that like there is an expiration date typically on kind of his shtick, and credit to him. I mean, you know, like they obviously kind of went as far as they could before they just completely fell apart physically last year. But that's also one of those things that, you know, is the knock on Tibbs historically, right? Is that he just plays his dudes too much, and they have the depth that they shouldn't need to do that. But we've also seen that he just can't necessarily help himself. And you know, I don't know. Like I forget who it was. Somebody was like making the argument. One of the New York media guys made the argument in the first round that it's like, oh no, actually, like the level of fitness that they built up is what is the reason they beat the Sixers. And then, you know, all their like heads fall off and limbs start, you know, decaying immediately when they play the Pacers. It's like, yeah, well, you know, kind of you wait out long enough. This is kind of what happened. So yeah, the Knicks are going to be, I think, just such an interesting team, and I think they're going to be good. But yeah, I mean, I certainly hope some of those negatives play a factor in helping the Bucks kind of nip back ahead of them.
The Hartenstein absence is obviously big, and then I mean, also it means okay, we lost that. We brought back Precious Achua, and we still have Julius Randle. But that was the other interesting part about last year.
Yeah,
right.
Like, what does that even do?
You know, we pointed to their record with OG Anunoby on the floor, and then also the elephant in the room was, is this team better without Julius Randle on the floor? Like, do all the pieces fit better? Yeah, and now you're going to be relying on him pretty heavily. Frank, the Tibbs stuff that you mentioned too. I mean, Jalen Brunson was fantastic last year, but couldn't make it through the second round. And somebody of his size too, with the physicality that he plays at, with the minutes that Tibbs is going to play him, that has to be a concern. I mean, I know we've all joked Tibbs just has to be salivating that he finally has a player on his roster that has played 83 games in a regular season. But I have those questions about the Knicks of, like you mentioned, we've seen this in Chicago and Minnesota, that it ages like milk a lot of times with the way that Tibbs will play his guys. And I know it's only been a couple of years, but did everything break right for them last year? Because I think right now everybody is probably, if you ran the survey out there and said which team's going to fall back this season, I wouldn't be shocked if the Bucks got a decent amount of those votes from people from afar. But I think the other team that probably is getting that would be the Pacers, when you look at them and say, well, this is just the Atlanta Hawks all over again from a couple of years ago.
Yeah, they had a good path to the playoffs.
I'm curious. The thing I'm so interested with Indiana is, like, Halliburton clearly was kind of not the same guy
himself
in the second half of the year, and it never got better. And he obviously didn't play in the Olympics at all. I'm just really curious, like with this, you know, like with the hamstring stuff, I don't know, like you would think he would get back closer to what he was in the first half of the season by this fall. But part of me also just kind of wonders, like, I don't know, I mean, was there maybe just a little bit of, I don't want to say fool's gold, but like, I just don't know what to do with that. And obviously as a Bucks fan, like I
mean, we saw across the board. Yeah. I mean, to that point, I don't think this was it per se, but we saw across the board, the offensive efficiency and everything else was a lot different across the league until mid-January.
Yeah. Interesting thing too about just on Brunson as well. I do kind of wonder, I mean, I think like Randall could be valuable just in terms of taking some of the pressure and some of the workload off him. Because as you said, I mean, for Jalen Brunson, I mean, to be a 29 points per game guy last year, I mean, he's obviously a lot bigger than Isaiah Thomas, but just in terms of like career arc and just like, oh my God, this guy is like an MVP candidate, apparently, like an all NBA, like second team guy. Like it just is so bizarre that like just the trajectory just kept going up. And obviously he, you know, hasn't sustained an injury like Isaiah Thomas did. And he's obviously bigger and stronger than Isaiah was, which is, you know, obviously important. But it's interesting. I mean, you look at him in the playoffs. I mean, he went up to 32 points a game in 40 minutes per game, but his efficiency went way down, shot 31% from three, I think 53% true shooting, which is obviously, you know, very poor in the year 2024. So yeah, it's just, it is kind of one of those things. It's like, I mean, would anybody be shocked if he kind of came back down at least to maybe like his first year in New York numbers, where he was like more of a 23, 24 point per game guy on good, but not spectacular efficiency, right? Like that feels like it probably would be a more reasonable place to be, especially if he's sharing the ball with the likes of Bridges and Randall's healthy. But I don't know. I mean, Knicks fans should be super excited, but yeah, I don't know. It's definitely it's going to be an interesting test case this year, and I think, especially with Dame, seeing how Dame stacks up against the likes of a Halliburton, likes of a Brunson, right? Like I'm sure he's looking at those guys and being like, I'm better than these dudes, right? Like I want to go out and prove it. And if he's at least on those guys' level, and then you throw in that you have Giannis again, like I think it's easy to. I think people sometimes get in this game of trying to like compare like top 7 versus top 7, and overvaluing the differences in the like 4 through 7 guys. And it's like, look, if you have a Giannis at the top of your roster, like that makes a lot of like your problems go away, right? That papers over a lot of problems. And at the end of the day, you look at the East, you still have Giannis, and if Embiid is healthy, regular season, sure. Like I think Embiid can be on, Giannis's level in terms of productivity. But other than that, I mean, Tatum's not at that level, or hasn't been to this point. Certainly hasn't been in high leverage moments in the playoffs and the finals these last couple of years. And, again, like, is Jalen Brunson, like, are we seriously saying Jalen Brunson is on Giannis's level? Like, come on, and similarly for Indiana, et cetera. So yeah, like basically, like hopefully this season is a referendum on Giannis's dominance and greatness. And if that's the case, and if that's what tells the story of, these top East teams, then again, knock on wood, he's healthy. But we should feel pretty good, right? At the end of the day, we have a Hulk, and that's a pretty good place to be.
This next segment of Locked On Bucks is brought to you by BetterHelp. It's always something you'd love to learn. As an adult, do you find yourself making time to learn new things as often as you did when you were younger? Or was that lost in childhood? Kids are always learning and growing, but as adults, sometimes we lose that curiosity. Therapy can help you connect with your sense of wonder, because your back to school era can come at any age. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It is entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. All you have to do is fill out a brief questionnaire. From there, you get matched with a licensed therapist and can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Rediscover your curiosity with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. It sounds like the answer is yes, but would you both take the Bucks to continue their, what would it be, 7-year streak of winning the Central Division? As important as it is to hang the division championship banners.
Let's do it.
I think
September.
I would go that route. Yeah.
Cleveland over our dead bodies, Cavs.
Definitely. And the Pistons, we're not, no. Bull.
Evan Mobley, come on.
The next Giannis.
Yeah.
We were told.
Get out of here. GTFO.
When you bring up Brunson and everything else and talking about Dame and how he stacks up against Brunson and Halliburton and some of those other names, and certainly NBA 2K slotting him as an 89 overall, 5 points lower than a year ago. We've talked to Camille and I have talked about this quite a bit already this week, but how would I word this without getting in trouble here? And who's more important to the Bucks this season? Dame being the guy that we saw in Portland, or Giannis continuing to be Giannis?
Yeah, I mean, I listened to you guys talk about, some of the like prop bets and over-unders and some of that stuff, like for the player stuff. I definitely, and look, I'm at heart obviously a Giannis fan,
right,
in addition to obviously a Bucks fan, but Giannis is, my favorite all-time Buck. I put him obviously on a pedestal, and I think, as I was just alluding to in the previous comments, I think if you're trying to, over-engineer the Bucks need to do this and that to get Dame to this point, and Giannis needs to take a step back. Part of me is like, all of last season as well, when there was this discussion around like, well, Giannis needs to like let Dame cook more and stuff. And it's just like, all right, guys, like if you're trying to fix something, like if that involves like taking the ball away and getting fewer shots for the guy who averages 30 points on 65% true shooting, I feel like we're barking up the wrong tree a bit here.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not to say you can't tweak things on the margins a bit, right? It's not to say that, like some of the Giannis bring it up the court and try to run the offense by himself. Like some of that, like probably, especially when Dame's on the floor, you could, I think, rebalance things to be more Dame centric in some of those times. But, at the end of the day, I just think sometimes people overthink it. And like the idea of like, oh, Giannis needs to be a role man. It's like, he can be a role man and he can be a handler and he can be a post guy and he can do everything in between, right? So I think with Giannis, it's always about finding the balance. I think for the Bucks offensively, it's always about finding the balance. And, especially I look at this team, I still think this team is probably a short one creator in the backcourt. And I think that means that Giannis and Chris need to continue to have the ball in their hands a fair bit, especially when Dame is out of the game. So, I still view like, look, this is Giannis's team, and I'm happy to see, and I don't think it's a big deal if Giannis continues to score 30 points a game if he's as efficient as he was last year. And I think it's on Dame. Like if your usage is slightly lower, to figure out a way to still be efficient and effective.
Yeah.
And I think part of the problem too is, and I think one of the really interesting things to watch for all of these, like whether it's Brunson or Dame or these other guards, Dame suffered from the reduced foul calling that happened last year. And I think if you're going to take the bear case on Dame's future, and if you want to take the glass half empty view of Dame's future, aside from even being 34, I think it's that if they continue to officiate the way that they did the second half of last season, that's going to hurt him, because he is a guy who relies on his kind of guile and trickery to generate foul calls and get to the free throw line. And that's obviously, when you're a 90-something% free throw shooter, like that's hugely valuable. So I think, again, like to me, it's like Dame needs to fit in more with Giannis and Chris versus those guys need to make a bunch of sacrifices to make sure that Dame gets to whatever statistical milestone we want to come up with. And especially because Dame's not getting any younger. So yeah, I don't know. And I think like, as far as like MVP stuff, like I wouldn't put a dime on, Dame long shot MVP stuff, just because I don't think he's good enough. Like, and at the end of the day, like, I think I was trying to think like, I think you guys brought up a good point, right? Like, how many times has somebody won an MVP when they have like a legit superstar on the team with them? And it, you guys are right. Like it, when KD went to Golden State, pretty much ended his and Steph's MVP chances. I think like Dame being here reduces Giannis's MVP equity. And I think honestly, like that's been part of Jokic's benefit, is that he's never had a guy who's like an awesome regular season player, with Jamal Murray being kind of just like 19 points a game and then becomes much better in the playoffs guy. So I think that hurts Giannis. And I think again, like there's never been a Jeff Kent over Barry Bonds MVP situation in the NBA, as far as like I can recall, right? Where a guy who's clearly not as good in the grand scheme of the universe wins MVP because of, some circumstances. Maybe it happened when there were like injuries or something like that. But, if for Dame to win an MVP, it would just have to be, I think, like the weirdest combination of Giannis being hurt and the Bucks being awesome still in spite of that. And I'm just like, I just don't believe in Dame quite enough for that. I think we know it's the guys that you mentioned. I think we know the guys that have, the 99% chance of winning MVP. And it's, the short list of Giannis, Embiid, Jokic, Shea, and Luka, right? Like if it was anybody else, I would be totally shocked, right? Like, I mean, maybe Tatum has some small chance, but I think it's got to be one of those like elite guys. And so hopefully it's Giannis, because that would mean the Bucks are awesome next year. But I think, as you guys hit on, like they got to be at least the 2 seed for Giannis to have a chance, especially given the let's be honest. I mean, there is a bias, I think, against Giannis. Like, it's kind of old news.
Yes.
The only Jeff Kent-esque MVP I can think of. Was Serge Ibaka still on the Thunder when Russ won his MVP? Like, that's the only one that's close. Yeah, I mean, and that's what I've grappled with quite a bit too, is you kind of want to talk yourself into, well, I mean, we've seen Dame close, so maybe he should do this and we should tailor the offense to this. And Giannis should not necessarily be second on the team or a supplemental guy, but hey, it's okay if his numbers take a step backward, if Dame's take a step up there. But to that point, Frank, it's like, well, why wouldn't I just optimize what's already working and see how I can boost the other part? Like, don't make your best part take a step backward for something else to get to the level that is a step backward. And I think that's the difficult part. Is the big thing for Dame is he doesn't have to average 30 points a game. And we talked about, if the Bucks are going to be at that level and be really good, like, they're not going to contend for a championship if you get a similar season as last year from Dame this upcoming season. It has to be better than that. Whether or not that's unfair, it wasn't a bad season. It just wasn't what you anticipated to get from Damian Lillard. But efficiency is going to be the big thing. Like, if Dame can be the guy that can close games and we see the efficiencies take a step forward for him this season, that's more important than Damian Lillard averaging 30 points or matching Giannis in scoring.
Yeah, that's the piece of it for Dame that I fall back onto, where it's like, maybe this upcoming season you see a thing where Dame's points per game goes up and Giannis's comes down a little bit, but I don't even think that would be necessarily a byproduct of Dame having a lot more shots, but just knocking him down at a more consistent rate than what we saw last year. And maybe with that, with them figuring out who's going to have the ball in which situations, and when is it Dame's time to, initiate the offense? When is it Chris? When is it Giannis? So on and so forth. And them getting that rhythm down. It's like, maybe you see Giannis's other stats go up. Maybe you see the assist go up again after a career year that he had this particular season. Maybe it's a thing where you see Dame's points per game go up or the assists go up. Like, I think there's a couple of different ways to get there for this team, but I don't think the right way to do it is that every time, every game, it's going to be Dame. Whereas it should be a situation of like, here's the game plan, or here's how the game flow is going. And this is the hot hand, and let's feed that, and let's lean into this in this particular game, instead of trying to force other pieces into that puzzle when you can see it's going a certain direction. But for Dame, like, he's just going to have to keep shooting. He's going to keep that aggressiveness going for it for sure. I just hope to see it at a more consistent, efficient clip for him going into this upcoming season.
I think the other thing too is, like, I think back to like late last season and the offense really dipped right after Doc came. Like, the defense improved a little bit and the offense dipped. And I think, again, like, a lot of that you can point to, even though it's not like Dame was bad after the All-Star break or something like that, but his free throws went down a fair bit. They perked up a bit in the last couple weeks of the season, but the free throw numbers were worse. And I think, honestly, like, I think they got so caught up in just spamming Dame Giannis pick and roll, especially late in games. Like, I think about that Laker game, like, every possession was just Dame Giannis pick and roll. And, it was like the thing that everybody had been hung up on all year was like, why don't you run the Dame Giannis pick and roll more? You run the Dame Giannis pick and roll more. And I don't know. My view was always like, and I'm just, again, I said it earlier, like, I'm always big on like balance and just like doing different stuff, even if maybe you go away from the single most obvious thing to do a little bit more than you might otherwise in like a high leverage situation. But it felt like, honestly, like, it got kind of like you would have hoped that they got into a rhythm, but part of me feels like they kind of, like, it got too predictable. And so I don't know. I mean, obviously we're all going to be paying attention to that dynamic this season. But again, I don't want to see Dame just standing in the corner, in first quarters a lot, like we saw early last season. I'd rather have a Dame Giannis pick and roll over that. But yeah, I mean, this is part of the challenge for Doc to figure out, is like, what is that mix and balance that works best. And again, like, for Dame, I think part of the problem for Dame is, like, he's he's like arguably, you know, the best bad shot maker in the league. So like, you know, running efficient offense with Dame means taking shots that are not really efficient for most other guys. So it's kind of hard, right? He's like the opposite of Giannis, whereas like Giannis, you know, it's just like all about creating dunks and finishes that are extremely high percentage for him. With Dame, it's like, you know, when he's at his best, he's taking, you know, 30-foot pull-up shots. And a couple of years ago, he got to the rim a lot and was really good on 2-point shots, whereas last year he kind of fell back down to earth kind of across the board in terms of his 2-point efficiency, which was a big part of his struggles as well. So, yeah, I don't know. I'm really curious to see just how the Dame experience goes, but it is funny. I mean, I think probably the most enjoyable Dame stretches for us that we saw last year were when he just gets into that rhythm and zone, and there is nothing you can do about it, no matter how well you're defending him. But it is kind of a hard thing, I think, to, I don't know, like think about the X's and O's of it, because again, like you're not having to drop a perfect play that creates a layup for him, even though he can get to the rim as well. I did think one of the things that I was surprised by was how little like floater game he seemed to have. It seemed like he too often would try to get to the rim and then, you know, get a little off balance and kind of take tough shots close to the basket. But like, it wasn't like he was trying to get to like little push shots or floaters. It did seem like, you know, again, he was really kind of all or nothing. Either he's getting to the rim or he's settling for like a step back, you know, 18-footer or something. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's just, you live and die by it. He's so talented. It's kind of hard to say like, don't take those shots, just take layups. Because obviously his track record speaks for itself. But I mean, we'll see. We'll see if the math adds up for him this year. Because if it does, the ceiling of this team is
pretty good.
Yeah.
Well, we'll start to get some more clarity on some of those answers in 3.5 weeks when media day is already about to be here, and then training camp the next day, and the preseason, I think, a week after that. So we've almost made it through the dead spot of the off season, but a lot of requests for it to get Frank back on the show. So we've checked off that box here a couple of times this week. That will do it for today's show. For Frank and Camille, I'm Justin. We will talk to you once again next week on Locked On Bucks.